Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jayakula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are.
The prayer that keeps coming to me lately is, Lord, have mercy. And I know that in our tradition, mercy doesn't mean be easy on us, which I think is what I mean in my prayer. But
of course.
I wanted to ask you to talk about mercy.
Well, first of all, when we say prayers, at a certain point, your typical prayers like, Lord, have mercy, or please just stop this from happening, or make something else happen, or make me be well, or because this is a tradition where we have at least teachings, if not the recognition, that everything is made of enlightened wisdom, so there's not actually anything wrong. We can still have the feeling in our dualistic conditions that we want to pray and ask for something, and that's totally fine. So we're in a situation where this alive, aware reality has created dualistic experience for the purpose of having dialogue, having conversation. And prayer, of course, is a very powerful form of conversation. So we'll have the attitude not that prayer is necessary in some more dualistic way, but that it's just something we do here. And it's completely fine to express yourself that way. The other thing is, and I've said this before, I can't emphasize enough that there's a form of sincerity that goes beyond anything. That is just like an incredible power. And most of us, of course, are only mildly sincere at times. And then and then even when we try to muster up some more powerful form of sincerity, we usually bungle it. But occasionally in life, we do have this unified request that can come out of us. And those are very, very, very powerful requests. So that's just about asking for things in general. And there is, beyond any explanation, a quality of mercy that permeates everything. When we think of mercy, we think of, as you said, we're going to be relieved of our suffering. But like compassion and devotion and all of the virtues, there's no reason for mercy. It just is a quality of the absolute. And you can feel it. I mean, mercy is very closely related to beneficence, which is the main quality of God. So this reality, beneficence is its main attribute. I mean, that's a silly thing to say, but mercy is related to that. And like all of it, it just is. It has no cause. It has no conditions. And it doesn't operate how we think it does from our more limited perspective. Sometimes, but not always. For instance, look what is happening in Gaza. You might say, well, there's no mercy there. These people are just suffering unimaginably. Yeah, we have people, a group of people, who have over many, many centuries strengthened their relationship to God to such a degree that even when confronted with what they're confronted with and what they're experiencing, they still take refuge in God, and they are demonstrating that to the whole world. I'm not saying every single Palestinian is in that condition, but in general, they have a quality that they've cultivated over many centuries of taking refuge in what we would call God or the divine or the absolute. No matter what is happening, even things that we can't really imagine what it feels like to go through those things. And they are not only doing it, they have this saying, Allah is the best disposer of affairs, meaning everything is fine. Everything is Allah, everything that's happening. And they just keep repeating that over and over again, and we keep hearing it over and over again. So there's some quality of mercy in that they have that to rely on, and that we can hear it.
I think along those lines, I'd love to hear your take on peace.
When I was an undergraduate, I had this very funny teacher. He was my philosophy teacher, and he was also a farmer. So his whole office was piled up with egg cartons. And he would come to school to teach in this ripped pink sweatshirt and these big muddy boots. It was very cute. And he once said something about being at a dinner party, and somebody turned to him as a conversation starter and said, "I believe in hope." and he thought this was very, very funny. But there's some parallel between that and people who say, "I believe in peace." In this tradition, it doesn't really matter what you believe in. No one cares. We're just trying to work with circumstances as they actually are and be skillful and open-hearted. And so what you believe in, what does that actually get you? We have to deal with what's right in front of us. What's right in front of us, I think, is that humans are not a peaceful lot. For my money, for my spiritual dollar, no one's laughing at me. Shall I continue, or should I just give up and become somber? For my money, a better question is, what can we do about our lack of peacefulness? What can we do about our cruelty? That would be a better question than rolling around talking about, I want peace. All I want is peace. I was saying to somebody, I don't remember who, that occasionally I doom scroll through the Facebook profiles of other spiritual teachers to see what they're saying about, or not saying in general, about gossip. Now no one's saying anything, but in the beginning there was like a couple of people who were making these sort of watery remarks about world peace. This is just not being real. We don't have world peace. We've never had world peace. And why is that? Because we don't deal with how we actually are. And I think that one of the blessings of this last year plus is that some of us are getting to see and having to deal with more of how we actually are. And that's very, very painful and heavy, but it's also a necessity for spiritual growth. It's also a necessity for ordinary growth, planetary growth, earth growth, because the same applies to spiritual life as applies to anything. Without honesty, without clear seeing, without being practical and dealing with what is, we can't get anywhere. We're always then dealing with just concepts like, I want peace, something like that. Peace is really something that we have to come into by seeing how things are and working with things as they are, not by just having some fantasy. Most of the people who talk about peace, at least in my circles, are really just branding themselves. They're trying to sound like they have compassion or some idea about something, but without actually getting into any trouble. It's basically what they're doing, right? So it's a cop-out, I think. One of the great openings of this time is that we get to contemplate, well, what is change? What would change actually look like? How do we actually change how we relate to each other? We get to see that, well, no, we're not going to get to just go sideways on this, because our planet is facing many, many different kinds of extinction events, and the beings and the plants here, and we're not going to get to go sideways on this one. We're not going to just get to make a horizontal move and basically try to keep everything going the way it has been going, because it's not, it actually is not continuing the way that we want it to, or some people want it to. We are going to have to create vertical change, something that is actually moving in a different direction, or it's going to be created for us by our ineptitude. We are getting bad stop already. Bad stop is what I call it, when you should have stopped, but you didn't. And you got many, 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 many messages and signals that you should have stopped, but you didn't. And then you get bad stop, which is basically the accumulated results of all the things you should have done but didn't. So we're basically already in the zone of bad stop. And it's going to happen. And the idea is to try to get out ahead of it and really examine things and how they are. And try to figure out how can we actually change something. Change is possible. It doesn't mean that we're going in some big progression toward the better, but we can enter into a different cycle of how we approach things. In Hinduism, these are called yugas. Each yuga is basically just a different kind of approach to things, depending on how much access to wisdom we have. So what is called upon right now is more access to wisdom and applying that to how we live together. We're either going to do that or the change is going to happen as a result of not doing it. But either way, it's going to be very, very different than what we've been used to. And it won't be peaceful. This kind of change is never peaceful. But it could be based on compassion and open-heartedness and more clear seeing. I looked up the numbers yesterday of the different sizes of the Pandava and the Kaurava armies. In the Mahabharata, which is a tale of wisdom and ignorance duking it out at the change of a yuga, at the change of one of these big periods of time, the army of ignorance is more than twice as big as the army of wisdom. And the leaders of the army of ignorance are 10 times more in numbers than the leaders of the army of wisdom. Think about that. I'm not proposing any grand thing that we're going to do at Jayakula. I'm not on some missionary thing. It's just we do have a part to play.
And so that also makes me think that as individuals or groups or countries or whatever size people, you also have to look at yourselves.
Oh, yeah.
Self.
Absolutely.
But I feel like so many people on the planet right now don't want to do that part.
I think it relates to what I just said about numbers, that there's also counterflows to this insistence on ignorance. Think about Tibet getting invaded by the Chinese. Now, Tibetan teachers are all over the globe, and Buddhism's the fastest growing spiritual tradition on earth. That happened as a result of violence and colonialism, basically. Many more people, as a result of what's been going on the last year plus, or even since the first Trump presidency, are learning much more about our real history and our real government and our real role in the world. And just on an ordinary level, like there's people having more clarity about that and wanting to do something about that. So there are counterflows to this other part, which you're referencing, which is people digging in their heels and saying, no, let's just try to figure out how we can keep going this way without any consequences for me. So we see that, but I think there are also counterflows, and those counterflows are what pull us through into a new situation, and not necessarily in our lifetime. You know, that's one of the things. We don't know how bad things are going to get before we kind of get to a new place, or a place that we haven't been in a while. Not necessarily new, but I would look around and look at the more participatory cultures of younger generations. Look at how technology that's ruining the planet is also connecting people. Like, one of the amazing to me, or just utterly moving things to me about what's happening in Palestine is the real intimacies that are forming between people all over the globe and everyday Palestinians. We hear about like all the brave journalists and stuff, but there's also people forming relationships with ambulance drivers and people cooking on the street on a wood fire with humanitarian aid that's been dropped on them. There's many strata of Palestinian life that people are connecting with. And I just find that really, really moving, and a really different situation than we've been in before, where people are actually communicating on a daily basis with somebody in another country experiencing these kinds of things. There's the destruction that's happening on the one hand, and then there's something coming out of that destruction that is a counterflow. And just looking at my experience of my own individual life as a practitioner, looking at my experience of history, looking at my engagement with traditions like the I Ching and Hinduism, where they have a cyclical view of history, basically, I do have an experience of these kinds of cycles where there's a period where things are very dark and destructive, and then wisdom comes out of that. And we all have that experience in our personal lives too. Everybody has that experience. I mean, you don't have to do any practice to have that experience. Anybody that's ever experienced a great loss, which is every single one of us, or an illness that was more difficult, or an illness of a loved one, or some kind of gross unfairness or something in your life, if we have a little bit of self-reflective capacity, we come out of those experiences understanding that we gained wisdom from them. So this process that's happening on a micro scale with each of us individually is also happening on a macro scale globally, and they're connected. What are we going to do about that? You know, all the people who don't want to see what's happening and don't want to do anything about it, we become the people who are willing to look at ourselves, willing to excavate our own cruelty and defensiveness, and willing to form new kinds of communities. We become those people. What other people are doing, we don't have to worry about that really so much. We have to do that. I've been saying since Trump first got elected, he's a mirror. Trump is a mirror. He shows us a lot about our country, and he's a mirror of the kind of narcissism that a lot of people embody. And it doesn't do any good to make monsters out of people like that, because we must look in the mirror and see what aspects of them we can find written a little smaller in ourselves. That's what they're there for. That's what the monsters are for. The monsters are mirrors. So that's one way that the macro and the micro get connected, and we can use them. But again, we just need to focus on waking up more, getting more clarity, being more open-hearted in the fine grain of our everyday lives, using everything in our environment, bringing everything onto the path, and joining together with people who are doing the same, and not letting ourselves get too depressed about those who are not. It's hard. This is a tall order. But we can do this. We absolutely can do it.
I mean, you've told us many times in regards to hosting that the bog you come into it with is important. And I had the experience the other day of cooking dinner when I was crabby, and it didn't taste as good. And it just made me think, clearly have had my own experience of entering into hosting with a certain bog or not, but then it made me start thinking about that in a larger way, of even doing small things with a different energy behind them. Like if I walk the dog and I'm distracted or something, he doesn't behave as well because I'm not paying attention to him. I'm not focused on what I'm doing, or I'm not caring about him as part, like having communication.
It's not really about paying attention. It's more being in that more relaxed presence, feeling of more relaxed presence. So your attention could be wide and, not necessarily laser focused on Georgie, but
Or dinner.
or dinner. But if you're just feeling what's happening and being more in that presence, feeling more that presence of wisdom, then whatever you do is going to be received better and taste better. Thoroughness and attention to things flows out of that deeper relaxation. So it's not like we force ourselves to attend to something, and that makes it better. It might, maybe you like put a wrong spice in your food because you were crabby, but that's not the kind of attention we're looking for. When I was younger and I first started hearing from friends who were just starting to practice in some Buddhist traditions about being one-pointed and paying attention to the present, I always had this image in my mind of them being like, paying attention. We don't want that. Basically, if you just relax and get back in touch with whatever it is you're in touch with when you do non-conceptual meditation or when you're in satsang or whatever it is, you're just relaxing in that. It's a very broad attention and it's relaxed. It's not effortful. But then everything will flow more precisely and thoroughly from that. And everything will feel more intended to and cared for.
Now that you say that, like the dinner example, I think was because I was too focused on my own suffering in the moment of being in a bad mood.
That creates lack of skill, even though we think that if I'm laser focused, I'm going to do it better. It's actually less skillful. So just try to remember that integrating with presence is really what it's about, and getting back in touch with that sense of accompaniment and the theater of life that's unfolding everywhere comes into view in this more vivid way. And that's where precision and thoroughness are at their height, when our focus is widest and most relaxed. I was just thinking when you were saying about like the food didn't taste so good because you were crabby, what I thought was we're living in a crabby country. Everything doesn't taste right because we have crabby government, we have crabby institutions. Everything's just sort of cooking in a soured way. But that doesn't mean that we can't cook in a beautiful way.
Satsang with Shambhavi is produced by Jayakula, a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. If you enjoyed listening, please help us keep this podcast and many other teachings open to all by making a monthly or one-time donation. Visit jayakula.org to make a donation and explore more of our offerings.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.